Hi everyone, welcome to my channel Code with Ease by Varsha. So based on the recent community poll that we had done, we are doing this video. And the reason why this video is so very important is you need to understand that not every HTTP request and response only starts from the Spring MVC from the controller layer. So you may have to manipulate the HTTP request and response even before it reaches the controller layer. For example, you may need to add rate limiting, authentication, authorization, encoding of request response. So there can be a bunch of different things which you may have to do and thus manipulate the HTTP request and response. And that is where filters and interceptors will have an important role to play. Please approach this video from the perspective that what if tomorrow you need to write your own custom filter and your custom interceptor, then how would you approach writing that? So for that reason, we are doing this video so that you get to know what is the difference between a filter and interceptor. We'll do a hands-on code demo to understand how to write a custom filter and interceptor. So a lot of different things. Hope you guys are going to get some value out of it. So without further ado, let's begin. So before we start and go into the theory knowledge of this, you have to understand why are we doing this video? Why do we need to know about filter and interceptor? Firstly, because if you're working with a code base which already has filters and interceptors, you need to understand, read the code base, understand the implication, why they are being written. That could be one reason, let's say you're working with such code base. Secondly, what if you need to introduce a custom filter or a custom interceptor for some use case? So at that point in time, you may feel very confused, like you do not know what is a filter, firstly, and let alone writing a custom filter. So that is the point of view with which you should approach this video. Don't take it like just another technical or a theoretical concept which you just have to mug up, but think from that perspective that what if you tomorrow have to write a custom interceptor, then how will you take a call whether you should write a filter or an interceptor? How should you write an interceptor so that it actually work the way it should? So that is the mindset with which you should approach today's video. Okay, so now we will talk about what is filter, what is interceptor, differences between both of them, what are the different use cases, when to use each one of them. Let us talk about all of that in detail before we go to our idea. So filters and interceptors are used to handle the HTTP request and response. Now, that is what happens at the Spring MVC level also. How is it different? How is it different? They are different because they help us to manage the cross-cutting concerns. What are cross-cutting concerns? Anything that applies to your entire application. Very simple example like logging. Logging needs to be applied across every parts of your application. Again, second example can be authentication. Would you want your would you want your user? So suppose you're trying to give access to your application. Would you want anybody to gain access to that application without authentication? No. So authentication is something which is not specific to any controller. It is not specific to any module or feature. It is something which has to be applied across your entire application. So similar to logging, authentication. These are the cross-cutting concerns that we have to manage. Like we are using aspect-oriented programming for managing the cross-cutting concern. But when these cross-cutting concerns are to be managed from the HTTP request and the HTTP response level, who are going to help us? Filters and interceptors going to help us. They are centralizing this entire management of these concerns. So now what are filters? Filters are operating at the servlet container level, like at the Tomcat. Tomcat's container level, it is handling it. They are basically intercepting the request as soon as it enters the container. Now, again, if you are not understanding the flow, so I already have a diagram on the right hand side. You can refer to that. I also have a sequence diagram, which I'm going to discuss in a while. So how the flow of the request comes in. So you have an HTTP request, Tomcat server is receiving your request. Then the servlet will start the filter chain. So basically, your handlers or your controllers are over here. They are the last. Before that, there is a filter chain. The filters are going to process. Then you have a dispatcher servlet. So actual game starts from a dispatcher servlet. So before even reaching the dispatcher servlet is what you have to do the handling. So now how do they work? So in the right hand side, we have the diagram. So we have the Tomcat, the servlet container, the embedded servlet container resides over there. So as soon as it reaches Tomcat, now we think from Tomcat it will go to controller. It is not so. In between, there is a dispatcher servlet. The request will reach the dispatcher servlet only after it has passed through the filters, the filter chain. It's like a chain of processing that happens. Now, before reaching the servlet, the dispatcher servlet, these filters are going to run. So in these filters, we will have all that logic that we want to do with the HTTP, with the incoming HTTP request. Okay. Only when it is passed successfully from the filter is when we are going to forward to dispatcher servlet, and finally from there it will go to interceptors and finally to controller. So you can think before reaching controller, before reaching dispatcher servlet is where the filters are at play. Okay. So what are the things, the actions that happen in the filter? Very important thing is blocking. Like you do not even want a certain request to reach the controller, right? Some kind of rate limiting you want to do, or some kind of blocking you want to do, some maintenance mode kind of a check you want to put. All of that you can do it in the filter so that it will never reach till your controller. That is one important thing. And apart from that, pre-processing, post-processing, all of these things which I mentioned over here, those are the like the cross-cutting concerns, like I said, or some manipulation of the HTTP, incoming request and response, all of that is happening. But does filter only work when the request is coming? And what about the response when it is outgoing? Then also does filter come at play? We will look at that when we discuss the sequence diagram. So far we understood where the filters work, what is the purpose, why do we need them, what are the capabilities that filters are having. Implementation, the lowest level implementation which was available, which is not much used these days, is the directly we don't use the filter class. We use different implementations which are part of the Spring Frameworks web package. So we'll see that when we will do a code demo. So this is what the entire story about filters are. Okay, so now let us take a look at what are interceptors. Where do they function? See, we have reached dispatcher servlet. Our filters have run. We have done the processing, whatever we want to do inside the filters. It has returned successfully. Now it has forwarded to dispatcher servlet. Now after dispatcher servlet, we are going to run the interceptors. Okay, so just before controller is being hit, the interceptors come into play. So they are part of the Spring framework and they operate within the Spring dispatcher servlet's request handling process. Very important. They will intercept the request specifically within that MVC. So the MVC framework you can say is starting between these three blocks. The MVC framework, it is entered the MVC framework now. Now over here, the interceptors are going to work. Now what is the difference between the work? What is the difference between the capability between a filter and an interceptor? As we can understand, filters will apply holistically on every kind of request as a whole. But interceptors are only going to be concerned about anything that comes into the controller. Now, let's say you hit any file. Let's say we will also see that it's an HTML file, any static asset that you have tried to hit. That is also an HTTP request. Filters will work upon those, but interceptors will not intercept any kind of a static file request. Okay, because static file request, until you are hitting until you are uploading something to the server using controller, it is not going to take that into account. Okay, so what are the capabilities of interceptors? Now, here authentication authorization plays a very important role. Now, let's say you have reached this point. Now, before entering the controller, now you want to check whether the user has the sufficient rights, where you want to check the authorization. You may have to check the API token, like the X access token, the session token, all of that. If the validity of the tokens, you may have to check. Let's say you have got encrypted request, you may want to decrypt the request. So, all of those handling that you have to do, how are you going to do that? That we are not writing any logic on the controller, because this is global. It needs to apply to every request that comes to controller. The payload has to be decrypted globally, let's say. So in that case, we will add that logic inside an interceptor. Okay. So that is the basic difference between filters and interceptors. When to use each one of them, we will again come to them. Interceptors are implemented using handler interceptor interface. We will take a look at that when we see the code demo. So what are the key differences? The level of operation, it is the lowest level. The filter, the lowest level is at the filter. Like it will intercept everything and anything. Interceptors are higher level because they are operating inside the Spring MVC framework. The scope is, like I said, static files, static resources. Filters will apply to any static resources, but interceptors are only going to apply to your web request, not any static resource. Again, what is the context? Filters have access to the servlet API, and interceptors will have access to these clusters. Now, this is something very granular control is what is being given. This is not important. The first two things you have to keep in mind that will give you clarity. Should you write a custom filter or should you write a custom interceptor? Now, finally, let us take a very quick glimpse at the use cases, when to use each one of them. These are not like the only use cases. Just have jotted down 5 use cases each of filters and interceptors. You can pause, take a screenshot, take a note, whatever you would want. But this is very important. Filters, like I said, will be used for request, which is like any kind of request, okay, not just controller ones. So like I gave the example of the maintenance mode, that you may want to block the traffic because your site is under maintenance. You might have seen certain websites mention that, right? So you can simply write one line of code in the filter and your maintenance mode is on. Rate limiting, then API key validation. Usually, API key validation is something which uh, course headers you want to add. Rate limiting, because anything that will apply for any kind of request, it can be a spam request, any kind of request, basically, that is anything that is trying to come to your controller, it is trying to intercept over there only, because we don't know what kind of request is coming. Only when it has filtered it out, let's say rate limiting is already done, it has the proper API key also, all of that is done, it will give a green signal, go ahead, then it will reach the controller. In the controller, we will actually take the token which has come in, and then we will check whether whatever information of that user who has logged in, we want to extract that information. Then authorization, like I said, we are going to check authorization, authentication, log request time. So all of these things can be done on the interceptor level, right? So this is what is about the entire conceptual knowledge about filters and interceptor that you need to have. So into the ID, now this is the pom.xml. I'm using version 3.4.1 and Java version 17. How can you get started if you are not having any prior experience of bootstrapping your own project? You can go to start.spring.io. Okay, this is the Spring initializer. Select your language, select the type of, let's say, select the language and some Maven project. Then select what version. So in my case, I'm using 3.4.1. You can select any version which is 3.4.x, the latest one, and don't use any snapshot version. And the main thing is, apart from entering the group ID, artifact details, and everything, uh, important thing is the version of Java, right? And also the dependencies which you need to add. Now, for the scope of filters and interceptor demo that we are doing, only Spring Web dependency is more than enough. That is what you would need. So if you go to the pom.xml, that is what you will see. That's the bare minimum dependency that we are using. So this is just going to give you a head start. It's going to bootstrap your project. This is the first thing which you need to do. When you download the zip from here, basically you're going to get a main class and you're going to get this pom.xml. Everything else you'll have to build. So now let's move into the classes one by one and let us see what are the changes that we have done. So this is the main class. Okay, this is a demo application like we had. This is a main class. And going first of all to the filter class. So we have created a package called filters, and over there we have first created our logging filter. So we'll create both filter and interceptor, and we'll do one round of the flow of each, and we'll show the difference between filter and interceptor first. Now notice here, first we have a class. Ignore this @order annotation as of now. We'll talk about this when we introduce another filter. You can ignore this as of now. I'll just comment it out. Here we are extending a class called once per request filter, which means this filter, whatever business logic you're doing in this filter, in this case, we're just logging. In other cases, you may want to do some other changes to the filter, like, for example, you're doing some rate limiting, you're doing some request request response encoding, compression, decompression. Like there can be a bunch of different things as we have discussed. So whatever business logic is being run inside the filter, that will be run only once per request. So that is why we are extending this class, which is coming from the web dependency, from the Spring's web framework. We are coming. But in many cases, you would also see the very basic filter class, okay, which is coming from the JavaX. Okay. Now, if you go into this class, this is basically coming from not JavaX anymore because it got renamed with latest versions of Java. It's now Jakarta package. So it's Jakarta.servlet. It has got nothing to do with the Spring. So now this is a very basic filter, okay, wherein you will have a do filter which you can override, init and destroy. So this is very basic. Okay. Now, what is the difference between this filter class and once per request filter? So as the name suggests, once per request is going to run once only. In case if you would have used the normal filter class, which is under this package, it would have run multiple times. Like for example, if your page is getting forwarded to some error page, is getting forwarded or redirected to some other page, then the filter would again run that because it will treat that as a new request. So the problem with that is your request, which has come, your HTTP request, which has come, is getting filtered multiple times, even if that is not a fresh request, but just because you're redirecting or forwarding it to another page. So that is why when working with Spring Boot, the better, safer, and cleaner way is to use once per request, because internally what it will do is if it has already been filtered out once, why do you want to filter it again? That is the basic change. Now, over here, if I go into this class, you see that this is the important method, the do filter. Okay. And then we have also something called do filter internal, which is the abstract method which needs to be implemented in our implementation. Okay. So that is why when you will write this class extends, you will have to, if I just uncomment this, you see that we'll have to override or implement the abstract method, which is do filter internal. Okay. Now, what this does, do filter internal is basically, so if you see something interesting that although this do filter internal has got 16 implementations, and you can see there are multiple filters who have used this for doing bunch of different operations. Like I said, character encoding. Then we have something called URL handler, then forwarded header filter, hidden HTTP method filter. So there are different classes which come as part of Spring's web framework. Okay. Now inside Spring's web framework, we also have a filter package within which there are multiple filter classes, which is provided by Spring itself. On top of that, if you're doing any custom filter requirements as per your business logic, is when you actually need to implement this abstract method and write your own business logic, which in this case is we're trying to do some logging. Now, if you already have the use case defined, like if any of these classes are already achieving what you want to achieve, you do not have to write a custom filter. So now this is where the actual magic happens. So if I go back to the code, so in our case, it's a very simple demo. We have three parameters: the request, the response, and the filter chain. So filter chain is going to actually do that filter chaining. It's going to forward, like the filter chain that we discussed. It is going to actually forward your request to the Spring's dispatcher servlet. Now over here, we are just trying to log it out. Okay, now you could have used SL4J also, but I've just used this out over here. We're just logging out what was the request that came, the URI of that request. You can do anything that you want to print. You can print context, path, method, whatever you want to print, you can print over here. And we are doing filter chain or do filter. Now, if you do not write this, this is not going to work. Okay, it is going to stop. It is not even going to reach to your controller. So you have to write this. And that is about this filter class. Now, this filter, so whatever we needed to do about our custom filter is being done. Now, let me go to the interceptor. So we have an interceptors package. Over here, we have introduced a logging interceptor. So as we have discussed before, first the filter is going to run. The filter is going to run for your HTTP request as well as for any static files. I've already got a test.html file over here to show the difference. Now, logging interceptor, here we are implementing the handler interceptor. Okay. Now, what is this handler interceptor? It is coming from again from the web package. So this handler interceptor has got three important methods which needs to be overridden. which is pre-handle, post-handle, after completion. We already discussed about this. When does a pre-handle run? It is before the controller is getting executed. After controller is getting executed, you want to run some business logic. And finally, at the end, towards the end, when everything is done, when the request is completed, you want to run some business logic. So this is what is happening in each method. Again, placeholders are there, just simple sysouts. This needs to be replaced by what you actually want to do in case of interceptor. For example, you may want to check for some authentication or authorization in the interceptor's business logic. So you're free to do that. Now, this is what we have already done: interceptor and the logging filter. You can ignore the authentication filter as of now. We'll come to that. One more thing is the config class. So this interceptor needs to be registered with the interceptor registry. Okay. Again, part of the web framework. Over here, we are registered. So you can have multiple interceptors, right? So you can keep on adding dot add interceptor, and you can add your interceptor object over here. So we have just tried to auto wire this. And one more important thing is the path patterns. Now, path patterns can be added to an interceptor, it can be added to a filter also. So, if we talk of path patterns, what do we mean by that is because interceptor is going to run at controller level. So, whatever logic that we have written inside the interceptor is only going to apply to anything which starts with API/API. So we can have another controller to demonstrate that anything which doesn't start with API/API is the context part. It is the interceptor is not going to run basically. The logging interceptor is not going to work. It is not going to do the logging work. So that is what we have done. So very simple. What is this web config doing? You have a configuration class. You're just trying to auto the object. And over here, since you're implementing the web MVC configurer, which is this class, over here we have a bunch of different methods which we can configure. In this case, we have just added an interceptor, so we are registering it. So that is what we are trying to do over here. Very simple. Our filter class is done, interceptor class is done, and also the config class is done. What are we left with? The controller. Plain and simple hello world controller, nothing fancy. Now what is going to happen when we run this? When we are going to run this, first we are expecting the filter to run. Then the will when we're running this, we'll hit the controller, of course. When we're hitting the controller, the filter should run. The pre-handled method should run. Then the controller's method should get printed. So let me just write here. Uh, hello wrong test, because this needs to be printed on the console also. So just for clarity. So now we are ready. So let's run this. So server started, go to Postman, hello controller we should be getting. So we are getting hello from test control. Let me go to the console. So what has actually happened? We got a message from the controller, but what really happened to our interceptor and the filter? Why it didn't run? So let's try to debug that. So if I go into this, what are the issues that we have created? First of all, this is a class, but there is no bean or component associated with this. So we need to mark this with @component. Only then filter will be registered technically. Okay. But what about the but what about the interceptor? Why it didn't work? So if you see this interceptor's configuration had a path pattern. Remember I talked about path pattern as /API. But here our request mapping has /test. So I've intentionally kept like that, so that I just wanted you guys to pause and think about what is wrong. So we had /test and we had given the path parameter, the path pattern as /API. So two ways: either we make it to test, okay, or we create another controller, whatever. So let us try to restart the server, and now let's see. server started. Let me hit it again. Okay, going to the console. Yeah, now we have the logs. So first, the filter, the request URI has been printed. Then the interceptor before controller, which means the pre-handle method have been called, which is over here before controller. Then we got the hello from the test controller, what we printed. Then after controller, after complete request. Now in between post handle and after completion, if your view rendering and all of that stuff is happening, then you will have some difference in that, a difference in the output in that. But basically wanted to highlight the flow. Filter is running, interceptor is running, and then post handle, pre handle, post handle, and then after completion. All of this is handled. Now, one more thing I wanted to show. Now, this was an HTTP request. What if I'm trying to hit a static file, which was the test.html? Okay, so let me just copy this. So in that case, the expectation is the interceptor is not going to run. So I'm going to just hit the static file. This is also a request. So I'm getting the HTML file that this is a static file. But if I go into this, okay, you see I am only getting the log from the filter, which is /test.html. Interceptor has not been touched because we have not hit a HTTP request, because interceptor will only run from a controller perspective. Here it is a static file that we have accessed. So this is the basic difference which we have highlighted, that filters will run for all kind of requests. Interceptor will only run for the HTTP requests which are coming from the controller level. Simple. So we have understood about the flow. We have understood about the difference between filter and interceptor. We have also understood about how the path patterns come into play. One more thing which we have to understand is about that annotation of @order, which is important when you have multiple filters actually. So I'll stop the recording over here. So let me go to this second filter. Okay. Now we have discussed this before, that you may have multiple filters, and that is why the name filter chain. So what is happening is, why we need multiple filters is because first is the general, let's say you're trying to log the request. Now on top of that, you want to do some additional processing or pre-processing, better to say. So for that, you would need multiple filters. Now let's say you have, here we have two filters, but let's say in your business application, you have 5-6 filters. How will you control the ordering, the flow of execution, that which filter should run first, followed by another? Like you cannot have the authentication filter or any kind of request response parsing that you're doing before you log it out, because otherwise, if there is any error, it will get filtered out and you would have never got a chance to log what was the request in the first place. So that is why the logging filter has to run first, followed by any other filter, which in this case is an authentication filter. What are we doing in this authentication filter? In this, we are checking whether we have a authorization header and whether that matches a given value which we have. Like now this is a sample value. It can be anything that you are trying to generate. Maybe you're taking it from your DB, you're hitting some third party API, some kind of token which you're validating against. Now, this is the work of the filter, that it is going to check whether I have header, whether it is authorized, and whether I have the right value. So this is the logic, that I'm checking if the request has a header. If it is null, over there only I'm setting it to unauthorized. I'm not moving it further to the controller level. I'm filtering it out over there. But if it has the token, I'm checking also whether the valid token has been passed or not. So now coming to the order over here, I have put @order2. So it starts from 1, 2. So lower the value means the first it will get executed. So in case of logging filter, I had order 1. So I will uncomment this. First we should execute logging filter. Followed by that, we should execute the authentication filter. So with that, now let's rerun the server and see both the filters in action. Okay, so let me hit this. Okay, so now interestingly, we have hit this test.html, and you see the problem is, this is a simple static file. Now We may have authorization over here also, but here, because the filter is working on every kind of request, even when we are hitting the static file there also, we would need the token. And same would have happened if we are hitting this particular request. So over here, what I'll do, I'll go to headers and I'll add the authorization. And so what is the value of this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and it is going to check. So we have we have to precede this with the bearer. We have to write bearer and then this. Now we are getting the response. If I go into this, so you would see, let me clear this. We are getting the logs over here. So this is how we can understand how both the filters are working together, and why we need the @ order annotation to define the flow of execution between multiple filters.